I am deeply honored to be here today. Very honored to be here with two human rights leaders in Congress, Congressman McGovern, Congressman Smith, with all of the distinguished speakers that you will hear from today. Most of all, to be here with the members of the Lantos Foundation, with their family. Certainly, I've gotten to know over the years Ambassador Swett and obviously Dr. Swett and their great leadership, not only here, but in New Hampshire as well. And this is just such a wonderful legacy for someone who has dedicated his life to protecting the rights of all around the world, including members of our own country. And so I'm deeply honored to be here today. I'm so pleased to join you in honoring the bravery of Chen Guangcheng and the universal values for which he bravely struggled. I'm proud that when Mr. Chen sought refuge, he came to the United States Embassy in Beijing. And I cannot think of a more appropriate place than the United States Capitol, the great seat of American democracy, to join with people from around the world to advance the cause of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, and to recognize someone who has bravely stood up in the face of oppression, who bravely stood up for women, for all people, to make sure that they could have universal rights. When you think of what Mr. Chen Guangcheng and his family have been through and what they have done, you know, it's one thing to talk about respect for human rights. It's another thing to put your life on the line, to stand up for others who are forced to undergo horrific things like forced abortions and forced sterilization. And we are all grateful to Mr. Chen for everything that he has done, not only for the Chinese people, but for the symbol that he is around the world of what one person can do and what one family, because I know that he's been greatly supported by his family, can do in the face of oppression and tyranny. I'm very proud that our country stands as a beacon of hope for oppressed people who live in the cold shadow of tyranny. Certainly, Congressman Lantos was someone who lived his life fighting oppression and tyranny. That's because we know that the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are universal, and that no government on earth has the right to unjustly deprive their people of these God-given rights. On December 10th of 1948, the United Nations General Assembly codified this fact in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The first words of the preamble proclaim recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Along with Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the 9 drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was Dr. Chen Guangcheng of China. When the declaration was passed in the General Assembly by a vote of 48-0, with 8 abstentions, China was among those voting yes. Yet today in China, there is a different government, one that seems to think that it can retain its monopoly on power by intimidating, oppressing, and censoring its people, as evidenced by what Mr. Chen Guangcheng has fought for and what he has endured, and for those he has stood up for. There should be no confusion in Beijing. The United States welcomes a strong and prosperous China that plays by the rules and contributes to global peace. Yet the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party has misidentified the greatest obstacle to China's future stability and prosperity. China will only reach its fullest potential when it recognizes the Chinese people's unalienable and universal rights, rather than seeing them as a threat to their monopoly on political power. A country can only reach its full potential when it has the full engagement and creativity and respects the rights of all of its citizens. As Mr. Chen asserted in a recent interview in Foreign Policy magazine, transformation is inevitable in China. No government can forever retain its grip on power by repressing its people. By opening their markets to the world, Chinese leaders have helped to lift millions out of poverty and certainly create an impressive record of economic growth. It is time for the Chinese government to match this economic liberalization with political liberalization. The best way for Chinese leaders to maintain domestic stability for the long term is to be responsive and respectful to the will of their people and respectful of the rights of all people. Yet at this critical moment in history, the United States and many of our fellow democracies are embroiled in a crisis of confidence. This crisis of confidence comes at a time when democratic progress of recent years and potential democratic breakthroughs really stand on the knife's edge. That's why the Lantos Foundation and this award and recognizing the efforts of Mr. Chen Guangcheng and his family and their bravery is so important with what we see happening around the world right now. With American leadership, as well as global support for courageous individuals like Mr. Chen, energized popular movements around the world can help secure another wave of democratization and human rights progress. Absent that leadership and international support, the coming years could witness a tragic authoritarian resurgence. The people of the world who are struggling to secure universal human rights we enjoy here in America are looking for our leadership, our support, and our moral clarity on these issues. Persecuted people from around the world need to know that the United States cares about them, understands and appreciates their suffering, and we will do everything we can to stand with them and to help them. When a dissident is imprisoned in China, as Mr. Chen has been, when a woman is persecuted in the Middle East, when a pastor is jailed in Iran, the United States cannot and must not be a passive observer. When scholars and United States leaders discuss America's foreign policy, they often speak in terms of interests, suggesting that we must choose between our national security interests and our democratic values. Let there be no confusion. To suggest that we must choose between our interests and our values is a false choice. That choice is short-sighted and dangerous, and we know that Congressman Lantos understood that. Sooner or later, the people of Syria, Iran, and China, for example, will attain their full birthright of freedom. And when they do, they will remember whether the United States and our people, whether we stood with them or we stood on the sidelines. In his 1947 speech before a joint session of Congress, President Truman said, "The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedoms. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of our own nation." Decades from now, it is my hope that there will be more democracies. It is my hope that the bravery that Mr. Chen has shown will bring human rights and progress to China and other countries around the world like Iran, Syria, the Middle East where people are oppressed, that his example will be an inspiration to all of us, that there will be fewer tyrannies in which dissidents need our protection and support. But when those remaining dissidents, like Mr. Chen, who show courage and bravery, who inspire all of us by his actions, when they look for our safety in the face of tyranny and oppression, it is my hope that we will always be there for them, that we will always stand up for individuals like Mr. Chen, and that we will always continue to recognize their bravery, their courage, and that they know that we will be there for them. It is truly an honor to be here today, just being in the presence of Mr. Chen and his family inspires me to continue working on these issues in Congress. And I want to thank every single person here. I know how dedicated you are to making sure that human rights are respected around the world. And oftentimes you aren't recognized for your efforts. Please know that we care deeply about what you're doing, and we deeply appreciate all of your hard work. And when we see someone like Mr. Chen standing on this stage, it really makes all of that work worth it. But we have so much more work to do. So let's rededicate our efforts in the name of Mr. Chen and those who fight for freedom around the world.
Good morning, and thank you, Senator Ayotte, for a very powerful and important message for all of us today. Before I begin my remarks and pivoting perhaps off of what Senator Ayotte was just saying, I know among us in the audience today are a number of people who are themselves dissident survivors of Tiananmen Square or other persecutions around the world, and particularly in China. So those of you who are here with us today who we have not previously recognized, I'd like to ask you to stand so that your sacrifice can be acknowledged by all of us. Please stand. Thank you. We are so pleased that all of you were able to join us today as we meet to bestow on Chen Guangcheng the Lantos Human Rights Prize. I hope that for each of you, this will be an occasion that you will long remember, because today all of us are truly in the presence of an extraordinary human being. You have heard by now the basic outlines of Guangcheng's improbable, incredible story. Born in poverty and obscurity, blinded in his childhood, denied any education until he was 18, this self-taught so-called barefoot lawyer somehow became one of China's most admired and effective advocates on behalf of the disabled, the exploited, and most notably on behalf of women victimized by China's brutal one-child policy. Of course, under the tyranny of the Chinese government, such good deeds could not go unpunished. And so Chen Guangcheng became an enemy of the state, subjected to persecution, torture, and imprisonment. In an act of courage that stunned the world and captured its imagination, Guangcheng made a nearly miraculous escape from brutal house detention under the very noses of his captors. In Chen's life, truly the facts have been stranger and more remarkable than fiction. And it is no wonder that in the minds of many, Chen Guangcheng has become the dashing superhero of the global human rights movement. And you know, it doesn't hurt that he also happens to be a very handsome man. But there is more to Chen Guangcheng than the heroic narrative I have just recited. This wise, brave, and insightful man has much to teach us about the true state of affairs in China and how we can act to advance the cause of democracy and human rights in this rising superpower. It is now widely known, though rarely reported in the Chinese media, that tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of large-scale protests are taking place in China every year. We shouldn't be surprised. There is an inherent instability in any society that is not built on the sure foundation of respect for the rule of law and the consent of the governed. The underlying lack of legitimacy of such societies cannot be sidestepped by robust economic growth or papered over by spectacular displays of wealth, prowess, and talent, such as we saw during the Beijing Olympics. Indeed, how humiliating and revealing it is for the Chinese government that the world-renowned artist Ai Weiwei, the architect of their greatest triumph on the international stage, the opening ceremonies of the 2008 Olympics, has himself become a target of prosecution and imprisonment for the crime of daring to speak out about freedom and individual rights. What does it say about a society when it feels compelled to attack and silence its most admired and respected members? Another lesson that Chen Guangcheng and countless other Chinese dissidents have been telling us is that technology and the almost magical power of the internet to disseminate information in the twinkling of an eye is undermining one of the key tools that dictators have wielded to maintain control, namely the power to lie and deceive on a vast scale. Of course, the Chinese government understands and fears the truth-telling power of the internet, which is why they have gone to unprecedented lengths to create the Great Firewall of China, manned by an army of 50,000 computer engineers to try and block the free flow of information from the Chinese people. This is one place where the US government can and must thwart their efforts. Secretary Clinton has articulated a robust and inspiring policy of American leadership on behalf of internet freedom around the world. But there is work that remains to be done to effectively fund and implement this policy. Just as Ronald Reagan, a generation ago, stood in Berlin and declared, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." We must today, the leaders of America must today declare to the leaders of China, tear down this internet firewall. And we must help in meaningful ways to make this happen. There is something else America must do, and this has also been expressed frequently and eloquently by Mr. Chen. We must place human rights and democracy at the center of our policy toward China. Every single person in this room understands that the United States and China are two great and powerful nations that must have functioning and meaningful relations on the full range of issues that concern our national interests, from the economy and the environment to security and terrorism. But that does not mean that we should de-link our concerns about human rights and democracy from the rest of our dealings with China. The Chinese government would love nothing more than for the American government to put human rights in a tidy little box off to one side where they can be largely ignored, save for the occasional rhetorical nod. This we must not do. It is in standing up for democracy and human rights that we are strong. Indeed, it is our commitment to these values and principles that has made us strong, and we must remember to lead with our strengths. I would like to close my remarks today with a few words about our Lantos laureate, a man we are so proud to be honoring, but in fact, we are the ones honored to be in his presence. I met Chen Guangcheng and his beautiful wife and partner, Wei Jing, for the first time yesterday, but already I have been profoundly affected by the spirit they exude. Words like simplicity, purity, and love come to mind when you are with them. But in listening to them both, one is keenly reminded that simplicity does not mean lack of sophistication, and purity does not mean naivete. Rather, the light that shines forth from these wonderful people reflects a quiet conviction that we must each find the courage to choose the right and to do the right. And if we do, we will ultimately prevail. You know, last night, some of us gathered with the Chens for sort of a big family dinner that was made all the more delightful by the presence of their 2 children, who just might be the sweetest, best-behaved 7- and 9-year-old kids I have ever met. Where are they? We should give them a round of applause right here. Having them there reminded me of my own busy years raising a large family. And so I will close with a story about a mother, a daughter, and how we can fix the world. A busy mom came home at the end of a long, tiring day of work, wanting nothing more than to sit and do nothing for 10 or 15 minutes. But waiting for her was her little girl, eager to play outside or do some other activity with Mom. Well, this mother was determined to get her few minutes of peace, but she also wanted to be a good parent, so she had a sudden brainstorm. She grabbed a magazine and flipped through the pages till she found one with an ad that had a picture of the world. She took it out, cut it into 25 pieces, and handed it to her daughter with some Scotch tape and said, "You go put this puzzle together, and when you're done, we'll play." Feeling pretty good about her parenting skills and confident she had bought herself at least 10 minutes of rest, she was taken aback when her daughter returned just a few minutes later with the world puzzle neatly taped together. The mother couldn't help but be impressed by her child's cleverness and asked, "How did you put it together so quickly?" The daughter turned the puzzle over to reveal a person on the other side and replied, "Well, Mommy, I just put the person together, and the world kind of took care of itself." I don't know if this dangerous and complicated world can quite take care of itself, but I do know that if each of us will try to follow Chen Guangcheng's powerful example of helping the people around us live lives of decency and dignity and justice, we will indeed be well on our way to putting together the puzzle of a better world. Thank you very much.